Hi, everyone. I'm Cindy Bierfoe. I just want to welcome everyone to the 18th Annual Hudson Valley Writers Center's Slappering Hole Press Poets and Writers on War and Peace Veterans Day reading. These readings had always been in person until the 2020 pandemic, when we started offering readings on Zoom and began to welcome people from all over the world. So wherever you are, welcome. And before I start the introductions, I'd like to ask if there are any veterans in the audience, and if you could raise your hands. Any veterans in the audience? Thought I was going to get some veterans. Okay. Well, if you're in the audience and you didn't raise your hand, thank you for your service. This evening is dedicated to you. Tonight, we welcome three outstanding poets who will read selections of their work: Claudia, Serea, Hajar Hussaini, and Nurkse. Their bios and links to their books will appear in the chat. And before we begin the reading, it's my pleasure to introduce Margot Stever, who is the founder of the Hudson Valley Writers Center and founder and co-editor of Slappering Hole Press, to say a few words about Slappering Hole Press. Margot.
Thanks, Cindy, and thank you so much for organizing this amazing reading with these phenomenal poets who you've got. And it's great to see a number of Slappering Hole Press poets in the audience and Slappering Hole Press Advisory Committee members as well. Founded in 1990 and now one of the oldest chapbook presses in the United States, Slappering Hole Press advances the national and international conversation of poetry and poetics, and provides opportunities for emerging poets. SHP's more than 50 chapbooks spotlight promising new poets whose work has not yet appeared in book form, and foster collaborations between emerging and established authors. Named from the Old Dutch for Sleepy Hollow, Slappering Hole Press is a small press imprint of the Hudson Valley Writers Center, which is writerscenter.org, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the literary arts. The Slappering Hole Press Advisory Committee, comprised of published poets, assists the co-editors in making decisions about the press. I'm the founder, and Susanna H. Case, Mervyn Taylor, and I are the current SHP co-editors. Starting with Gutenberg's development of the printing press in 1448, the chapbook has continued to serve as a critical literary form. In more recent years, poets have embraced the chapbook frequently to introduce new work. SHP chapbooks have found their way into many significant collections and have achieved national and even international recognition. Whether introducing never before published African poets such as Warsan Shire and Nick Makoa, emerging poets who later become important members of the literary community through SHP chapbook contests such as Julie Danho, Liz Marlowe, Andrea Deacon, and Tara Flint Taylor, or master women poets such as Elizabeth Alexander, Toy Daracot, or Denise Duhamel. With their choice of emerging poets in the Conversation series, Slappering Hole Press has always achieved much more than its tiny size would portend. Let's welcome the amazing poets on War and Peace, who we will hear tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margot. And I'm going to introduce now Susanna H. Case, who will introduce Claudia, Serea. We're going to hear from Claudia, and then we're going to hear from Hajar Hussaini, and then we're going to end with Nurkse. So Susanna Case, who is my friend, poet, and co-editor, is going to introduce Claudia.
Thank you, Cindy, and welcome everyone, and it's nice to see you here. I'm very pleased to be introducing Claudia Serea, who is one of the Red Wheelbarrow poets. In her recent book, In Those Years No One Slept, this is the book, and in other of her writings bears witness to the end of the Ceausescu regime in Romania, which was a period, as you know, of brutal oppression and its effects upon her family and her childhood. And other historical catastrophes are a part of her work as well. The season, for example, in which cherries, usually rare, were plentiful, for example, a pleasure for a hungry child, she writes about, but they're plentiful because birds had all been killed by the Chernobyl reactor explosion and hadn't thus eaten the crop. They glistened on the plate, she writes in Chernobyl Days. The 70s and 80s in Romania, then under communist rule, were periods of food shortages, hot water shortages, other shortages. Life was rationed and difficult. And though Serea was a child, she was clearly documenting in her memory the struggles of daily living, which later found their way into her poems, as did the immigration process in the 1990s, after she won the State Department's visa lottery and was thus able to get out of Romania. Claudia is also a translator, and her own poems have been translated into Arabic and other languages. I'm very proud to be her pressmate at Broadstone Books. Alina Cefenescu, who is another Romanian-American writer who I respect a lot, has characterized Claudia's work as her, quote, refusal of the tragic, that she insists on, quote, life as it was lived. In her very evocative account of persisting in playing the violin in school, despite a ceiling light fixture falling down next to her feet as she played, in her poem, How I Earned 10 Lei in second grade, we get in the strong child a sense of the woman who persisted and then turned to write about it. So here is Claudia Serea.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for Susanna for that wonderful, wonderful introduction. Thank you for Cindy and Margot and all the editors for inviting me to read. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you to everyone who decided to spend their evening with my poetry. So I want to read a few poems from my book, In Those Years No One Slept. It is a book about history and family, and I feel that my family is intertwined with the history of Romania, of Eastern Europe, and there's some more general poems about history in general. So I want to start with the title poem, In Those Years No One Slept, and it starts with an epigraph from Federico Garcia Lorca, Out in the sky, no one sleeps. No one, no one. Some, like my grandfather, slept standing, hiding among corn stalks and listening for dogs. The woods were full of women dressed in black. The woods were full of veiled women who'd come to him and ask, did you see my son? Is he still alive? The woods were full of veiled women and young men sleeping, standing behind every tree trunk. The woods were full. Young men wore rifles and slept standing behind every tree trunk. The women were dressed in black with large wings on their backs. Did you see my son, my husband, brother? The woods were full. So were the cemeteries, and everyone slept standing. So the first section is comprised of poems that talk more generally about history or tragic events in history. And this one is titled, My Grandmother Set Her Ladder Against the Moon. My grandmother was a very religious person, a woman who I believe religion helped her survive the events of her life. When her husband and sons were taken to political prisons in the 50s, and she lost everything. She lost the house, she lost all her belongings. So my grandmother set her ladder against the moon. She kept all her belongings in a small wooden trunk where she hid her despair among linens. Nightgown billowing in the wind, she climbed to the sky each evening on a thin ladder. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Why did you make my world bruised and blood warm? Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Why did you allow brothers to butcher each other? Give us this day our daily bread and forgive us our trespasses. Why did you give this burden to me? I can't carry it. As we forgive those who trespass against us, here it is translucent, quivering like the egg still unformed inside the hen. My life with no protective shell. And lead us not into temptation. Take it, but deliver us from evil. And I'll only keep this prayer for my family's return. Amen. So I feel that this prayer is needed, I guess, everywhere in the world. Maybe every people have their own version of this prayer. This one, because it's Veterans Day, and this is a poem titled Red Poppies. Small open mouths that sing, swallowing pain whole. They grow on battlefields and on abandoned land, unfurling red dresses from the dead's eyelids. Some call them wounds, weeds of eternal love, painted on money, flapping on flags. They write their own small history and give themselves to wind. Heads held by hairy stems and paper dry skin, so easy to snap and spill on the ground the sleepy black seeds. The paper children. I sit on the floor and decorate the room with paper cutouts. Silhouettes of children snapped from a folded newspaper fall from my hands. They float around the room, dancing, playing, pretending they aren't gone. Who remembers their names, parents, birth certificates? Their children paper the walls with voices and hummed songs. Podul piatră s-a dărâmat, a venit apa și l-a luat. The stone bridge is destroyed. The water came and took it away. Holding the words from the newsprint inside their bellies, meaningless clumps of letters, gone from their villages, gone from their mother's arms, names gone from their lips, floating above the room in ruins, still holding hands, still singing, pretending they don't know until they get to the stove. A red tongue shoots out and licks them into oblivion. And it is November, and here's a poem titled, It Was November, and I asked her to stay. While I slept, death made the beds, washed the linens, and pinned them on the clothesline in the breeze. She was a quick, slender woman who baked bread and made stew with a few red onions she found in the pantry. I guess she wanted to be a good house guest. She mended my socks, walked around the house in my slippers, soft as bunnies, and cut the last mums from the garden for my room. I was awakened by their scent, and she asked me, shears in hand, isn't this light, this late light, the prettiest you've seen? So this one is titled My Grandmother. My grandmother shows up in a lot of my poems, as does my father. My grandmother, the angel, and I. I'll sit in the hallway of the deserted winter palace next to my grandmother, next to the angel. The three of us will sit holding hands, still like statues, through the tide of revolutions, war clatter and thunder, and the dead silence that follows. We'll be the ones who burn slowly, protecting our small flames. My grandmother will wear her best flower headscarf. I'll have my Converse on. The angel will be bored. My grandmother, the angel, and I will wait for someone to open a window in the endless, shiny hallway. We'll wait for a breath of fresh wind or an explosion to blow us out like candles. And so I grew up during the Cold War, as Susanna mentioned, and I want to read this poem titled Cold, which kind of sums it all up. Cold. It was so cold, the war had frozen over. I could see my breath in the classroom, fluffy like cotton yarn, and my teachers and my high school colleagues. At home, I placed my hands over the reading lamp to turn them from blue to red. Mom bought fabrics, lining, batting, and snaps and made my brother and I ski costumes to wear to school. We slept with wool hats, wool socks, wool mittens, and wool sweaters so thick they were bullet and moth-proof. My breath turned to dew on the wall, then froze into intricate flowers and vines. It was so cold, the actors on the stage had visible breaths. In the theater audience, breathed in Shakespeare verse and exhaled cirrus wisps. The bride and groom kissed nonstop to keep warm, and the wedding guests spoke wide words before the food arrived. It was so cold the rocks cracked open. The doctors breathed white gauze as if ghosts were present in the operating rooms before opening the patients' steaming bellies. It was so cold, my circus lady neighbor brought home the pythons so they wouldn't freeze and kept them in the bathtub. She wore them to work, a tight suit under her mink fur. For decades, it was cold, cold. Each one of us exhaled a small cloud, proof we were alive. And so each summer, I went to my grandma's house, and she had a small garden where she grew tomatoes. This poem is titled, "We Ate the Ugly Ones." There was a fad in Romania at the time of, no matter how small your garden was, if you grew a few tomatoes, you could sell them eventually supposedly to go to the export or, and so we experienced some of that summer. We ate the ugly ones. The good ones, we picked and handled like eggs, sorted them by size and color, and placed them in rows in wooden crates. The Aztecs called them tomato, fat water with navel. The Italians pomodoro, apple of gold. And the scientists called them by their Latin name, Solanum lycopersicum, wolf peach of the sun. My grandmother called the tomatoes platagen. If they were good looking, they were worth more money. Her knotty hands, stained green from the sap, used a soft rag to shine each platagen like wiping a child's face, then nestled it carefully in its tutu of waxed paper. We ate the ugly ones, the scratched, the blemished, cracked, spotted, the overripe, the warted ones, tasty, fat from water and summer sun. The days were long, the lines to weigh the small crates longer, the money short. The yellow-green tomatoes went to export and ripened on the way. I wonder if anyone from the West knew when they picked them up from the supermarket shelf, weighing in hand the round red hearts. Did anyone know whose hearts they were, where they came from behind the iron curtain? I wonder if any of the ripe ones for the internal market would land on the dictator's plate. And if it did it bleed a little? Sweet juice under the knife. And this is the poem that Susanna mentioned, Chernobyl Days. We heard about it on Radio Free Europe. Weeks later, they distributed at school to each of us 2 small white pills of potassium iodine per day and wrapped the door handles in gauze moistened with disinfectant. Some of my classmates never took them. Apartment keys tied around their necks, kids played outside all day as usual. Summer came quickly with no birds. Mom bought us cherries from the market, so rare she couldn't pass them by, and washed them really well. They glistened on the plate. I want to skip ahead to the fateful year 1989, when all around Central and Eastern Europe, there was a whirlwind of revolutions, and finally it came to Romania. I think it was the last country to get to in December 1989. And I was a student at the time. And we were sent home early because the authorities didn't want to have students in Bucharest while this was going on, just to kind of avoid things getting worse. And it was a horrible crackdown that happened on December 21st. And I was home, and we would listen to the radio from Radio Free Europe, not the official radio. And I knew that there were high school students and other students in the streets, and very young men and women. And my mom and I, we were making sausage, getting ready for Christmas. So this is the poem, which won a Pushcart Prize. So I'm very proud of that. This poem titled Making Sausage in the Time of Revolution. This sausage is made during martial law. Lights turned off and the window covered with a heavy blanket that still lets through the white streaks of the tracers in the night sky. Place a candle in the cup. In its shaky light, we look like ghosts. Think of the ghosts in the streets. Think of the fires on barricades, the only candles these souls will have. On the table, set up the cast iron grinder with its large enameled maw, its helix, gears, and iron clamp. Think of the tanks and armored vehicles advancing like huge night insects, tens of boots grinding the pavement. Start grinding the lean meat and the white belly fat, piece by piece, one red chunk, one white, one red, one white, red, white. Stuff the grinder, careful to not catch your fingers. Think of the grinder that smashes students, young men and women shouting, Libertate te iubim, or in Vingem, or Murim. Freedom, we love you. We either win or we die. Grind, 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 grind. Stop and listen to explosions and the giddy chatter of the guns. Add salt, pepper to taste, crushed cloves of garlic and powdered sweet paprika. Taste the tear gas and pepper spray on students' faces. Sink your hands into the meat paste, hungry roots that turn and lift it, turn and lift again until blended and smooth. Add a little bone soup to soften the mix. Think of the water cannons, clotted bodies drenched in cold December. Pull the thin, almost transparent intestine onto the machine spout, bunched up, white like the stocking of a high school girl. Think of that girl, crowned with sniper bullets, and start pushing the paste in the machine against the machine. Push, 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 push with the force of a mudslide, its rage and fear and abandon. Push, 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 push until the dawn is born, unrecognizable and wet, and sanitation trucks roll in to wash the blood from the pavement. The candle burns to the bottom, and the only thing that remains is the smoke. So I want to read a couple of poems that I wrote when news of the war in Ukraine broke out. And it struck me deeply because of the landscape, because of the buildings and the cities that were bombed and destroyed, and I saw on the news, they looked exactly like Romanian cities. They, like my own, it could have been my hometown. So this is titled on BBC News, The Places Where I've Never Been. I recognize that road, a tongue of asphalt edged with crooked poplars, twisting for no apparent reason between two villages. I recognize that village where my mother-in-law could live, and its old women wearing house dresses and flowered headkerchiefs. Each house has a few chickens scratching the yard and a small garden where women grow cabbage and potatoes. I recognize the eyes on the potatoes. I've seen them open in the earth. I recognize the apartment block, a sprawling socialist concrete structure stretching along a boulevard named Victory or Independence, filled with little cement boxes, and in each box a family like ours, the furniture of my parents' youth covered in crochet doilies and an old Russian TV. I know by heart the ballerina bibelots, the colored blown glass fish, and the ubiquitous vitrina, the cabinet holding a bottle of Shivas and the liquor glasses we used only on rare occasions. I know the balconies, the playground, and the cars, even though I've never been to those cities. Bombed cities that could be my hometown. Streets that look exactly like the one of my childhood, strewn with bodies, where only limping three-legged dogs still live, and the dead open their eyes in the earth. This one is titled A History Lesson. Last night, warplanes flew in from Newark, and Clifton was shelled. I never saw people crawling on shredded limbs before. My neighbor fled with her 3 little girls, leaving behind her husband to fight the invaders. I hear the bridge over the Passaic River is blown up. Route 17 is bombed, and the Meadowlands are burning. People in New York City sleep in the subway, and the air raid sirens wail every 4 hours. That's when women deliver babies underground on piles of rubble. We sleep in the basement with packed suitcases in case we have to evacuate. Where would we go, though? I can't even go to the ShopRite in Lyndhurst, so I search the fridge for scraps to make soup from leftover bones. All the baby carrots I chop look like little fingers. Skinned and limping, spring still returns, sowing sunflower seeds. So every year I go to Romania and to visit family. I try to. And we always have conversations about what's going on in the world, and I'm sure many of you can relate. And this is a conversation based on a real conversation I had with my brother, a poem titled The Moon, My Brother and I. The moon, my brother and I sit outside at the wooden table covered with a white cloth and drink wine and moonshine from shiny tumblers. And we figure out the Americans, the Russians, the Romanians, the EU, and the Chinese. We're very well versed in this from decades behind the Iron Curtain. We know all about special interests, corporations, the military complex, stolen revolutions, the FSB, the Mossad, the CIA, the nationalists, and the globalists. Pour me some more freedom, baby brother. Alcohol makes us understand more. In its glaze, we see clearer for a few brief moments and agree we're fucked. And we sleep well tonight. Happy at least we get it until morning when everything is different. So I'm going to close with a little poem titled At the Edge of the World. I don't want to bring anything but my hollow heart and place it in a field of poppies and rapeseed at the edge of the world. There will be no wind, just the buzzing bees climbing into poppy moths. And my heart will lie there in the grass, and the bees will fill it with honey. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I don't even have words. I mean, what you did with these poems, they were to me almost like prayers, every one of them. Hard to move on, but I will. And I'm so glad I have your book because I will read it again. Thank you. Now Mervyn Taylor, who is a poet and another co-editor of Slappering Hole Press, will introduce Hajar Hussaini. And I just want to mention that in the chat we have a link to all of Claudia's books, and also I think we have bios in there as well. Okay, and lots of comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. That was beautiful. Hajar Hussaini is a member of that special breed, not just poet, but also literary translator, which puts her head and shoulders above anything that I can do. She's the author of a book of her earliest book of poem, Disbound. I'm sure she's written a whole lot since then, but she'll tell us more about that. Her poems in Disbound, it says, scrutinize the social, political, and historical traces inherited from one's language. The traces she finds, the flow of international commodities implied in a plosive consonant, an image of the world's nations convening to reject the full stop, retrieve a personal history between countries, Afghanistan and the United States, and languages, Persian and English, that has been constantly disrupted and distorted by war, governments, and media. Hussaini sees the subjectivity emerging out of these traces as mirroring the governments to whom she has been subject, blurring the line between her identity and her legal identification. The poems of Disbound seek beauty and understanding in sadness and confusion, and find a chance for love in displacement, even as the space for reconciliation in politics and thought seems to get narrow and narrower. This description seems most apt in these times. I enjoyed hearing about the way she searches language. It says that she explores other worlds. She's never been to the Caribbean, it says, but she understands the Caribbean through going to the poets and the poems of those regions. And I think that's a wonderful way for a poet to travel. I saw a word, and I hope that Hajar can explain me a little bit more about this. I think it's taruf. I think it's Persian for not being a victim, or not letting the language allow you to become the victim. Hajar Hussaini, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mervyn. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And Claudia, I really enjoyed your reading. In particular, the poems that you wrote in the aftermath of the Ukraine war really reminds us today in this moment that about the distorted experience of seeing horrible things, worse things happening to people that might look like you or have the same culture, the same language, and this constant reimagining of violence and different means is really at stake here today. Today, I will read poems from Disbound, and if we have time, I'll also finish it with one last poem, a recent poem. And Mervyn, I also didn't hear the Persian word that you mentioned. I'm sorry if you could repeat this again. I really appreciate it.
Was it taruf, T-A-R-O-O-F?
Yeah. Yes, yeah, Toruf, it's the Persian way of etiquette. Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. And if there was time, I would talk more about it in the Q&A.
Okay.
So to those who might not be familiar with the word disbound, it's an unusual word, but it really which I think its meaning is really central to understanding the book. And that's why I burdened the book one of the first few pages with the official Oxford Dictionary definition of the word, which means that the book or booklet, whether it's in the form of manuscript or a book, has lost its binding, and the fact that there has been a binding in the initiation process is really important for the book. I would start with reading the second part of the poem, Incumbency's Dispatch, and these are part of a series of poems I wrote with found language from Afghan social media, including government officials and political analysts. And this one is called The Reformers Dead End. And I used the language of former former president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani. So I'll read the poem now. Do you all hear me correct? Yeah. The reformers that end. In absence of an engineering mind, the ambience of peace is semi-transparent and by no means a lawless correspondence has prestige. When 5,000 evacuate this calendar will be ours. And there is nothing unless there is a finalized thing. I think mutual terror has guinea pigs. T's are limitless, and A's and T's are neither program-based. As for the bleeding, we should compromise, perhaps shut our tongues, and if required, count each hair strand. And if you have read the book or familiar with a few poems of which, you will notice this repetition of T's appearing over and over. And it's part of a movement of Afghan writers and intellectuals refusing to give name to the insurgency that is now in power. And A's was also shortened for Americans. The second poem I'll read is titled Inverse of Most Stories. And this is one of the free-ranging poems in the book. Murad Khani, which is a neighborhood in Kabul. Murad Khani once spelled for mundane ancient court, who is right and who is wrong. Lift of the old city or long dog battles and bird markets, on carpets, octagons in red. There were days men would have paid for love of quail in turquoise tomban outfits. They would bid on female offsprings, as patience the stone has entailed, but their kinds are already soiled dead, in battlefield, on the streets, in uniform, or with a long beard. An American surveillance balloon, godlike, watching. A pericardian store opening, the snow leopard 4, dead lives on the shelves, the chest made of marble, a Nugent continuum catwalk, whereas Ahmad Shah Massoud wore pakol. We Nugent rap and roll grass and we fuck from behind. Ours is the city of secret lovers. We buy light SIM cards on promotion days, smile at European counterparts our parents believed in. Tea house. This one has 2 words in Persian, actually 3. Chai khana means tea house, and shoras baran is onomatopoeia for the sound of rain in Farsi. Tea house. Please oil the door. That creaking sound, well-being at one or both ends, bolt-shaped hole, piercing silver nor gold, neither palmistry signs. At parlor shop where we went after chaikhana, asking to hang our bleeding jackets, humid, shoras baran. Second by second, I counted beats, praying for bodies that remained infinite water. Lemon tea, honey, please. This poem is titled Losing Sight, and I wrote it when I went to where my parents are originally from the central Afghanistan. Losing sight. A screw in my glasses came off, fell down the hill. I lost sight of a valley 5,000 years ago. I climbed to see a city on top. Instead, everything was in square-colored pixels, like a low-quality picture I have of Kabul in the 70s. Impermanence, missing of a boarding call in an airport, discovery of a lie after a commitment is made. A T blows himself up, in the midst of a ceasefire, blind among the mob of angry men, lynching Farkhunda, a woman wearing jeans beneath a burqa, a man who loved you more, who loves you less. Transhumance follows the harvest of soiled vegetations. Since lowland keeps warmer colors, its air decreased of density, highlighting farmers' faces, milking cows, tending eggs. All of this was happening. A flag party burned the Quran. It nicknamed Kabul. Our uncles formed the resistance. Seeks asylum in Iran, an ancient court as callous. In the way of Waziristan, a backyard decluttered. Carter introducing us to Mujahideen because we were not white. Headlines weren't heartbreaking. No revolution was for all. The dogs had to come back. Circling cell overtly fueled of prisoners. For there were more women in the universe. This is not part of the sentence. And this poem is titled Road Trip. And I wrote it during I was a student in Iowa, and at the time I lived in upstate, so I had to drive all the way, almost across the country, halfway across the country. Road trip is an extension movement of the right hand with multiple pinched nerves, a syndrome of being out the window, waiting for a gust. The odyssey is his, driving us. I'm only taking notes, browsing maps. Seemingly, they are moving us. A quarter tone scale curves my predisposition of being held in a historical maternal scent to get a glimpse of her grass-colored eyes if I close mine to the number of miles. The secret of lending credence to a ghostly appearance, carry a night dream into a discussion of what happened and scrub it off only after your teeth are clean. By the faculty of retrieving, I held her jaw in my palms, liquids barely circulating her body. In this language, the body is both alive and not. If I were to choose the strongest sense, touch, with its ability of measuring, its intelligence of distance. His ear to his chin is long for 5 inches. Outside, 5 silent hyphens pour over wallpapers. Scarecrow, fireflies, the barnyard. How the same grammar dictates my east splits volumes from its collective subject. And this one is titled Precedes Essence, and I will read 3 poems from this section of the book although my editor and I decided to disperse these poems, but they were actually written after punctuation marks, and I wrote 1 poem after every punctuation mark, with the exception of exclamation mark. We thought that it would be helpful, it would help the narrative arc of the book to kind of put them in disparate parts of the book. This one is after a backslash. And the title of it, Precedes Essence, refer to this idea of the essence of people actually precedes their actions. Its impulses disperse throughout the social dynamic. Subsequently, the expressive parts of my unit shake. It's imperative to choose not to speak. Anxious as an indication I could not enunciate. X is silent, a Russian ESL chalked in pseudo-North American accent. Lectures later, the disintegration of novel words into no further division. One figures meaning through breakage and adjacent to. Outside the map, occupying the periphery, your beliefs are minor chords. I've heard about the annihilation of the self. It's imperative to choose that notion. Let me describe what I perceive to be its actions. It saturates my incision foot, then pulls itself up. It stares into my eyeballs and then issues. So you think you're one of them? I wanted to get rid of it, but it drops by the delicate hours of my day, maintaining a typographical distance, poking me with a pen, donates me moleskin in these human conditions. It's imperative to read why I feel like this. At the bar's entrance, a friend tells me, why won't you apply for a state ID? You don't have to carry this history. In his reference to the past events, when the exterior presented the outright complication, I'm told everything depends on. And to say you a few words, to tell you a little about the punctuation series, I was interested in them because I thought of how within the language system, they would do a lot to make sentences cohere and separate different units of thoughts, but they weren't really considered part of the alphabet, and they never are. And within that marginality, I kind of felt the citizens of global South, whether they migrate to the North or whether they are there, it seems like to be carrying a burden that they're not really part of a movement of history, but yet they're doing much of the labor of the work that is necessary to sustain the planet. And I thought some kind of resemblance to these stupid markers who nobody really pays attention to, especially in poetry. Nobody cares. And they're, for longest time, they're not really poeticized either. So that kind of like disjuncture was really what was driving me to write these poems. And I think they allowed me to kind of be simultaneously like write poems that are about me, but then also not about me, to move between registers of language. This one is titled "The Parenthetical is Internal," and some of the times these punctuations are really visible. Like you can notice that this poem is really after this parenthetical, but some of the times they're less prominent. And there were reasons behind each of those decisions, which I'm not going to get into. But this poem is called "The Parenthetical is Internal," and it tries to like. I really appreciated Claudia's clarity when like she like works with memory. My memories has never been kind of like given me permission to access because I have repressed so much, and maybe because it has something to do with my age as well. But this one is about the memory of like looking at this bridge in Kabul that's almost like you can see like from underneath the bridge there's a lot of people who are using substances or who are addict, and that is more common now in a lot of American cities as well. So this was me trying to work with that memory. The parenthetical is internal. Perpendicular to underneath the burned bridge, a population at large is addict. Across the river, savor the magnificent landscape of shit. The most widespread predictions indicate a scattered non-for-profits. Future is alike. By the laws of currency exchange, helmet-wearing visitor brings a gift. Later happens an inferiority complex. Airy as comb cotton, plastic as Operation Freedom. Within us, walking in boots when we look up to India or Tajikistan. The 7th I left home, I played Michael Nyman's The Promise, and one program director scanned me for Afghanness, then adjusted his glasses, a reflection in which I prompted myself, don't take it as a compliment. I have dwelled in a hypothetical place of birth. I too wouldn't pick these identification markers. So I count the tells when someone says, be yourself. Of 10, 9 times they're northern. Not asked what was wrong about my parents, the reasons we are stationed here, whose faults are collective failures. Is the verb living differential? Past in the most tragic way, present. And this poem is called Meta Variable, and it works with colon, the punctuation mark colon, and I have used it as a shorthand for colonization. It's called, I think I already mentioned the title was Meta Variable. The colonized is part of the celestial object. Vis-a-vis the colonist, she discovers that her mind also thinks. Form is a superficial thing, ears are innately reflexive, and so she listens, but isn't buying the total deficiency. Homogeneously and imperialized is as envious and is told to remain seated. Meanwhile, she attends to what extent the two worlds are fundamentally different, aka one is under excessive stress. Argus-eyed, ambivalent on justice, how one realigns on whether she is out of line, reads the note in translation. Only one, the one that is more tired, this is the instruction. Then counting the counterintuitive, her tourist love, who claimed her country is a land of contradictions, the grand Buddha who ate his shit, her father who was both revolutionary and mechanical, home simultaneously warm and at war, marching on, monetarily dependent with checkpoints. Deep down, she finds a voice infused of neither hope nor question, comparatively indicates a tenacious presence. Day in and out, this subject, in diction, in peace, punctuates, is aware of the case for colonialism. PM writes in her circadian rhythm, barbed wire whose disentanglement should be a paid position. And I will read one poem that I've read. I've written very recently, and it's called Humanities. And I'll finish with this poem, Humanities. Now that I have turned myself into a human, I gather everything I have had, thoughts and poems, distilled in me an instrument with which I can comprehend emotions and question, why was I not simply born a human? Though I touched objects and beings, sensible, with the tip of my fingers, I made bread, and though I didn't drink wine, potatoes delighted me. The point is, I imagined the future, like an intellectual tends to the world around him by simply pressing next. But now that I have turned myself into a human, I gather all things, articles and art, are doable, for which I was fooled to think I'm simply made for giving birth alone. Thank you so much. And I look forward to reading Dennis.
Oh, thank you so much. Hajar, your gentle voice and then such powerful, powerful poems. I also thought about in the parenthetical, I had seen that poem and I thought that would be great to put on the screen because I think some of them are very visual and you can think about that in the future. But thank you so much for that reading. Dennis. I'm going to introduce Dennis now. Let me just supposed to do speak. Okay. So Dennis, oops, somehow, hold on a second. Just want to see. I'm not doing this right. Okay. So I met Dennis 30 some odd years ago. And it was at a poetry reading in the Bronx on Bach Cafe, and he was a feature, and he read from one of the books that he had written at that time, Shadow Wars or Staggered Light or Voices Over Water. And I just remember the feeling in the room, and it was one of my first poetry readings. I hadn't really known that people read their poems out loud. And the room fell silent, and we focused on his words, and it's that quiet strength of his poetry, the humbleness of his presence. And after he read, he stayed for the open mic, and I read a poem. And at the end of the reading, he spoke to me and he said, I'd like a copy of the poem. And I don't remember what the poem was, and I probably never sent it to him, but we became friends. And we shared stories over the years about our lives and our families, our children. And a few years later, I had a poetry series and I invited him to Mount Kisco. And he read from more books. And this time he read from The Rules of Paradise, The Fall, and then he read at Hudson Valley Writers Center for War and Peace, and in previous years, and more new books, Burnt Island, The Border Kingdom, A Night in Brooklyn. And he just kept writing, and they kept getting more and more reasons to ask him to come back and read his books. And now here we are again with his newest book, A Country of Strangers, New and Selected Poems. A Country of Strangers selects from 11 of his previous books with a section of new poems. And first I read his new poems and then continued reading the selected poems section. And I remembered all the poems from his previous books, where I was when I heard them. And Dennis has a way of finding words that, as Bill Moyers titled his book, The Language of Life, but deeper, perhaps the language of being human. Philip Levine expresses it best in his praise of Nurkse's work. I used to call you Dennis Nurkse, remember? Nurkse's work, saying, the voice behind these poems is that deepest voice we hear rarely, if ever, and then only in poems, the voice of those closest to us, those we love and care for, and who, because they are human, remain mysteries. No one is writing more potently than this. Dennis is the author of 12 books of poetry collections, most recently A Country of Strangers from Knopf. His work has appeared in the New Yorker Poetry, the American Poetry Review, and other magazines. He's a recipient of Literature Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, NYFA, and N.E.A. He has also worked professionally in human rights, served on the board of Amnesty International USA, and taught at Rikers Island. He currently is a long-term member of the writing faculty at Sarah Lawrence College, and he lives in Brooklyn with his wife, Beth Bosworth, and the wild puppy, Zephyr. And it is my honor to once again introduce the Nurkse.
Thank you so much. And please send me that poem after 35 years. Maybe you mailed it then, and
No.
given the post office, I'll get it tomorrow. And thank you so much Hajar, Claudia, those were extraordinary poems. Thank you, Margot, Jennifer, Mervyn, Cindy. I'm going to read a couple these are very old poems. Small countries. A man and a woman are lying together, listening to news of a war. The radio dial is the only light in the room. Casualties are read out. He thinks, those are people I no longer have to love. And he touches her hair and calls her name, but it sounds strange to her, like a stone left over from a house already built. This is a very old poem called Lamps and Fences. When the dead came into power, at first we did not notice. The stars were a little brighter. There were more roaches. Wherever we walked, we killed something. Since it was involuntary, it happened as if in secret. In the bars, the prices were written in chalk. The musicians were too eager to finish, though they remained true to the old rage. When we made love, our thoughts turned to the hunted, and those turned back from the frontier. Though the frontier was only the meaning of a sound in a language that had mastered us. This is a very recent poem called The War Against the Statues. The first skirmish, she says, lasted 6 days, or was it 40 years? The snow never stops pelting the helmets, the gun barrels, the churches, the union halls, the schools, the proclamations, the flags at half-mast. First, we won a great victory. We secured the mines, the river ports, the roads to the sea and the sea routes. Then disaster. We ran with rice in our cupped hands, and the children following as best they could up the icy steps to the holy mountain. It was long ago, she says, that peace was signed. We were allowed to return to our empty houses and our husbands, to love each other in a hard bed, to raise our young in honor of silence. And still the whirling snow turns on itself, adamant, blurring a scaffold, filling an open grave, glittering over fallow fields that stretch to the horizon and beyond, where silence reigns, where the stones of the road have human faces and justice is a sign pinned to a hanging man. This poem is about my father. My father was a sort of traumatized and uprooted person. He was Estonian. He grew up very poor and kind of made a life for himself, became an intellectual. But I think he never really trusted the world because he'd seen too many countries collapse. This poem is called God's War. When my father died, he still waited for me after soccer practice in his dusty liberal Volvo, double parked on a side street of Botanicas and Jiffy Lubes, a no-name hotel, a store that sold globes and star maps. Always in the past it was spring. Always he had just died. Always I kept him waiting deliberately, bragging to my friends about the goal I scored against Hamilton Park, across from the deep wing, a header, the goalie flailing. I still remember the elms of his street, their minnowy leaves riddled with tiny holes like braille, but too fine to feel. Names were gouged in the holes, savagely sealed with sap. If I make no apology, I thought, perhaps he won't even notice. His wristwatch was stone. So were his glasses and his times. The car was a huge stone. There was no way to enter it. Yet there he was, day after day, patient and bemused, loyal to a fault. My father, death had changed him less than the war, God's war, the war against the statues. I think that poem is a little about time never passing in my life. You know, it's as if we were still in the 1950s. I mean, we were kids protesting Nixon. If we had seen what would happen 50 years later, it's such a mercy that God doesn't show us the future. It's another poem about my father, who came to this country. He met my mother in 1940 on a boat out of Portugal. The dim tenements. What, I asked my father, is behind a wall? When you see a lit window through the rain, down a dark street, who lives there? When a car swishes past after midnight, sudden and decisive, where is it going? The voices in the alley, laughing and sobbing. What are they talking about? My father sighed and rolled his eyes while blinking furtively. It was an expression he had perfected during the fall of Narva, and cracked his knuckles, a hollow sound. He explained, behind the wall is another wall. The rain doesn't know itself. The car is fleeing. The voices have no idea what they are saying. When you come to the lit window at the end of life, I will be waiting for you, but the room will be empty. That poem refers to the town of Narva, which is in Estonia. It's a town where every building except one was destroyed in the Second World War. This poem also references it. It's a very early memory. It's called Poetry Recital. My best friend told me how his father cut off a sergeant's gangrenous leg with a penknife at Narva. This, as I finished declaiming, the moon was a ghostly galleon, spreading my arms wide, breathy tremor in my voice, which brought him to tears, tears of rage. I didn't understand what connection could there be between those soaring oohs and the besieged city, winter, the rusty, thumb-sized blade, slipping, catching, slipping. I really didn't understand when I was a kid why these traumatized people objected to my reading these beautiful poems. This is another poem from childhood. It's called Our Childhood in Brooklyn. 1. Remember when the war was close as a mosquito in our ears? We begged the church bells, please stop at 12, or else be a marriage or a funeral. All night sirens full of themselves, peaked and receded, breaking like voices, just vowels ridiculously near. St. Luke, Maimonides, Methodist, the firehouse. Be always there in that corner of the mind. Never go silent. Don't all wail at once. 2. Remember how we pinned each other down as if to draw lines around the body. How we took our places on the diamond, catcher, pitcher, ash silhouettes on coal. How we explained to little sister, not just us, but the elms, the crickets, the grouchy squirrels, the white star, N.E.A. Why the star, she asked. Won't the star last? Because it relies on us, dumbass. The night sky can't shine by itself. That's a sad poem. It's a poem about kids wondering if the world will last, if they do not last. I want to read one poem about that inspiring topic, US foreign policy. This poem is called Ben Adan. And it takes place at Bagram Air Force Base in Afghanistan. Ben Adan. The American commanded me in gestures, dig a hole. He tossed me a shovel, but the blade had dulled and the haft was splaying. So I had to rein in that strange, wild energy as I opened the earth to my shins, then my knees. At thigh depth, I found a layer of black loam and a tiny blue snail that seemed to give off light. The agent called my name. High above, he mimed a man kneeling, hands clasped in prayer. He must have knelt himself because I felt the muzzle pressed against the shallow furrow behind my left earlobe, a part of my body I never knew existed. He pulled the trigger, but I knew it was just a technique to soften my resistance. Perhaps in a moment, he will lift me up and hold me trembling, more scared than I, and more relieved. That's a poem about the mock execution, which is really one of the cruelest methods of torture because it's kind of appropriating somebody else's death. I'm gonna maybe conclude with 2 poems. The only war that I actually saw was the war in El Salvador, where I was as a journalist or observer with a Quaker group. And when I went to El Salvador, I remember the government of El Salvador had brochures in which they said, we may have lost the Second World War, but we're not going to lose the Third World War. And my government was giving them $12 billion a year. This poem is called The Checkpoints. At crossroads after crossroads, the military asked you for papers, sometimes friendly, sometimes begging a cigarette or a coin in your currency or baseball news, sometimes shouting, calling you whore, faggot, child, old man, sometimes pointing the gun straight into your mouth and waiting, sometimes handing you pictures of Jesus or revolutionary tracts, daring you to take them, sometimes asking you politely to wait. Then the day became a life already lived, now surplus. In that elastic time, you felt yourself become a helmet reflected in a filthy window while they called into radios and music answered. Once they took your papers and you felt your soul dying, but they brought them back with a neat stamp, war zone. Behind their dusty epaulets, you glimpsed a city that never quite ended. Shacks full of rusty turbines, boilers, bits of conveyor belts, files of old men waiting to vote, or children waiting for milk, then open country, dusty plains, empty except for water buffalo and cinders drifting. Sun heavy as a tombstone. You squinted at the ribbon of red dust and learned to slow for culverts, thorn hedges, blind curves, and not to answer if a peasant waved from the fields. Suddenly, you were in the mountains, range after range, burning as if serenely. In the sky, ranges of twisting smoke. The road ended, so you waited. At dusk, a whistle came. An hour later, another. Then a lamp wavered. You called your name, as if you were already there in that dry riverbed, under granite spurs glinting with heat, and a silence answered, the first since you came to that country. Only when dark fell could you hear the faint crackle of distant fires, a cricket, a guitar in the valley. The voice said, come to us. You obeyed, and at once the children had surrounded you. They pointed scornfully to their stumps, their bellies bloated with kwashiorkor, and led you to the banquet they had laid out, pancakes in fat, corn roasted in its husk, clay pots of rice, and ordered you in mime or in whispers, eat. The last poem is for my father. It's called Psalm to be read with closed eyes. Ignorance will carry me through the last days, the blistering cities, over briny rivers swarming with jellyfish, as once my father carried me from the car up the narrow steps to the white bed. And if I woke, I never knew it. Thank you.
Oh, Dennis, thank you so much. I'm always so proud to bring you to a read, to have you read and say, this is Dennis. You know, if you haven't read his book, where have you been? I hope you write more so I can keep inviting you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I was hoping that you were going to read what was the poem that Showers. That was one poem that I was waiting for, but I'll save that for another time. You'll have to come back. Thank you. These are all such perfect poems for our War and Peace poetry, sometimes very difficult. What is amazing to me is how gentle everyone's voice was for these powerful poems, and not easy to do. I just want to, I also want to thank Mariah for all the work you put into this and helping us stay online like this. And again, Dennis, Claudia, Hajar, Susanna, and Mervyn, thank you for your introductions. We weren't going to have a Q&A. I don't know how much we have, about, I think we have 5 minutes. But if someone has a burning desire, I just want to mention that it's really important that you buy the books. Poetry has to stay alive, and it's important that you have the books and you bring the books and you show books to other people. And I mean, the readings are wonderful, but please look at the links and try to buy these books. I have a few people I have to give presents to now. Is there anyone, I don't know how we do the questions in here. I think sometimes we ask a little bit about process, and maybe we have time for one person who'd like to talk about a little bit about their process of writing these poems. I mean, these are very difficult poems to write, and how do you keep yourself in that place and not, as we notice, keep your voice so gentle? Anyone, Hajar?
Yeah, in terms of my experience, at times it felt like when I was writing those poems, I wasn't really in control. It felt like I was a conduit for something to kind of emerge. Now that I'm writing again, I see the I mean, second book is terrifying, but the first one, I didn't know that I was writing a book. I didn't know that they would succumb to anything. And I think that was, I just picked up as it went, like one day at a time. So I would like to hear from people who have put out more books than my little one.
Sounds almost like you're saying you were just being a poet and responding to the voice that was telling you what to write. Yeah. Thank you. Dennis, did you want to say something?
There was I wish I could remember his name, but a French writer, and people asked him, "How is your work going?" And he said, "I advance in a mask." It could be a little pretentious, but I always like that idea of like advancing in a mask, meaning you do your work, but you're not. I think this is a little bit what Hajar is saying, is that you're not too conscious of your own identity or who you are. You're just letting it happen.
Thanks. Claudia, did you want to say something about
Yeah, for me, it helps to have a personal connection to something, even if it's, I write a lot about my own family. So that's my personal connection with history, Romania. But for the events in the world, I sometimes it's almost like an invented personal connection. Like you feel you connect to an object or to a landscape or to something. So you kind of like start somewhere, and then I use a lot of like natural elements. I connect through nature in poems. I mean, it's just a way to start. And then you kind of like, yeah, like the other said, it just happens from there. But I need a place that I connect, like I have an intimate connection to, usually.
Well,
it could be a memory, it could be just an image or something that stays with me from the news. but it needs to be a personal, like something that moves me personally, and I can connect it at a very kind of like intimate level with it, not just be a viewer, but almost like makes me participate or takes me there. Because otherwise I can't do it for the reader, for anyone. I can't, like the poem doesn't go if it doesn't have that. I mean, at least for me.
Thank you. Well, you know
I
what
think
I'd
that's
like,
beautiful. I think, they are just moments where you feel that you're awake and alive in the world and you don't know why, but it's almost like you enter those moments and you interrogate them and it leads you to a poem, but there's no agenda to it.
thank you. I'd like everyone to unmute for a moment, and I think you can all unmute and applause. So you can hear the applause.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much, everyone.
Thank you.